Thank you. So I am Melissa. I'm one of the curators at the Cold War Historic Preservation Program's curation facility. That's a mouthful. The curation facility that's located on site. I'll talk a little bit later about the SRS Museum and how we partner with them, but the curation facility where I work is where we house thousands of artifacts that are government property that have been collected over the years in order to preserve the history of this site. So because it's a federal property, that history of any of the buildings that are out there, we've been able to go in and kind of collect some of the artifacts, do oral histories with some of the workers who were out there, just in order to preserve the history. So I'll talk a little bit more about the curation facility and the museum towards the end of the presentation. But as Kathy mentioned, I am a lifelong Aikenite, so I have lived here a very long time, and I have to be honest, I didn't know what the site did before I started working on site. So just to kind of start out, how many of you worked on site at some point? Do we have any retirees? Oh, just a few. All right. How many of you know someone who worked on site? More. Yeah. Same. So when I was growing up, it felt like everybody worked on site, but I really had no clue. So one of the things that I really enjoy about my job now is being able to learn what was happening on site, but then also try to share it with the public because it has such an interesting history. The operations on site during the Cold War are fascinating, what they were able to accomplish, but there's also a lot of the community aspect, the local impact that the site made that I find really interesting. Having lived here and kind of starting to connect the dots of even road names and things like that, you start to see the connection of how that was from the site and how in the 1950s so much of the community was kind of shaped with the building of the Savannah River Site. All right, so I know that y'all can't read this. I can barely read this up here, but I'm going to try to read this letter. So this presentation is called Uniquely Qualified. And really, like I said, one of the interesting things about this site is that the history and what was being done in the 1950s really impacts what's happening on site today and has set the site up to continue national defense missions that started in the 1950s and are continuing today. So this letter is actually dated July 25th, 1950. Spoiler alert, the construction of the site started February 1951. So this was before there was ever even a site announcement. This is when they're starting to look at where the site is going to be built. So July 25th, 1950, dear Mr. Greenwalt, Mr. Greenwalt was Crawford Greenwalt. He was the president of the DuPont company. So DuPont ends up being hired in as they do the site selection, the design of the site, the construction of the site, and the operations of the site. So DuPont ends up being there from 1950 all the way up to 1989. So he says, the Atomic Energy Commission, this is, I think, the last time I'm going to pause here. The Atomic Energy Commission is kind of that leads into the Department of Energy much later on. So the Atomic Energy Commission was formed in 1946, and then ERDA comes kind of later in the 1970s, and then the Department of Energy, as we know it today, the site is managed by the Department of Energy today. So the Atomic Energy Commission has informed me that it has requested the DuPont company to undertake the design, construction, and operation of certain new facilities for the atomic energy program. The commission advises me that the company has within its organization technical, scientific, engineering, construction, and operating staffs capable of handling a task of this magnitude. The great resources of your company in these fields, together with the experience which it has acquired through the successful handling of the design, construction, and operation of the Hanford project during the war, make it uniquely qualified to undertake this most essential task. I want you to know that I consider this project as one of highest urgency and vitally important to our national security and defense. Very sincerely yours, Harry Truman. So this is President Truman asking DuPont to take on this project and saying they are uniquely qualified to handle this. So DuPont had previously done work. This mentions it as the Hanford project. You may know it better as the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb. So Harry Truman is asking DuPont to take on this project because he knows that they have some of the nuclear background that's needed, but also the safety record as well, to be able to do this national defense mission. So the task is, like I said, it's going to be post-Manhattan Project. The atomic bomb has already been developed, but Russia, really it's the tension with the Soviet Union that leads to this site being built. So the atomic bomb kind of technology is developed by the Soviet Union at this point, and so the United States is looking for how to respond. They already have the atomic bomb. They need something bigger than the atomic bomb. So that's going to be the hydrogen bomb, and that's going to need plutonium and tritium to be produced in order to make the hydrogen bomb. So the plutonium that had been being produced by the atomic bomb, they still needed those facilities to continue to produce plutonium for the atomic bomb. They didn't want to lose the stockpile of the atomic bomb from a national defense mission, but so they needed a location that could produce both plutonium and tritium, and there had not been a facility in the country that was focusing on tritium production. They knew how to produce tritium, but it really had kind of been a byproduct up until this point. So we end up with a kind of unprecedented construction task at hand. This is going to be one of the largest construction projects to happen in the country up until this point. And we're going to talk about some of the technology that's involved with that, kind of how they're able to do it with simultaneous construction, and then also look a little bit at the construction workforce. So with the new technology, I mentioned that plutonium had been being produced already. They knew how to make that. But with looking at a site that could produce both plutonium and tritium, it wouldn't be produced simultaneously necessarily, but the reactor needed to be able to have the flexibility to be able to produce different kind of weapons components and materials. So they were looking at a different kind of reactor. The Manhattan Project reactors, they were graphite moderated, and at the Savannah River plant, they decided to use heavy water as the moderator in the reactor. And we're not going to get super technical on things today, but I can't talk about the history of the Savannah River plant reactors without talking about the heavy water being the moderator, because this was such different technology. It was really being developed as they were building, and they had not used heavy water in a large-scale production reactor in the country before Savannah River plant. They didn't really use heavy water in reactors very often after that either. It worked fine, but heavy water is very expensive to produce, and it has to be extracted out of regular water. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk a little bit about the plant processes. But because of all this new technology, they are developing a lot of the research is happening as they're building. They do end up needing they use a heavy water test reactor. So the photo over on the left is actually of the test reactor. And it looks very much like a reactor room, but they could use this facility in order to just kind of see how the reactor rods were going to work. So all of this technology is kind of factored in from the very beginning with construction. DuPont knows they need to have a lab on site that's going to be able to help with some of the research and development. So the new technology plays in a lot. They have some of the background from the previous reactors in the nuclear field that DuPont has the experience with, but there are a lot of changes that are happening. So simultaneous construction, so the ground is broken February 1951. They have all 5 reactors up running, producing material by March 1955. So between 1951 and 1955, they get the reactors built, running, and we'll talk in a few minutes about all of the kind of background and kind of supplemental things that are needed to run a reactor. But they are producing product within about 4 years. And really, actually, I guess the first time that they're producing is by 1955. 2023, they have material produced. So within 2 years, they have 5 reactors, 2 separations plants, a heavy water extraction plant, all of the infrastructure set up and ready to go. So a very, very quick, if you think about all of that happening, it's across a 310 square mile facility. So it's a lot happening. And so in order to do that, they are building simultaneously. So this first picture is just of one of those planning meetings where they're talking about each area on site. So if you are familiar with the site, you know that there are many areas that go by a letter name on site. And so they are kind of looking at each area on site and seeing what phase of construction they're in on that first picture. The second picture is of the blueprint department. And the site had a newspaper that came out every 2 weeks. And so in 1951 to 1953, the newspaper said the blueprint department had about 650 acres. If you lined up all of the blueprints that they had between 1951 and 1953, about 650 acres worth of blueprints. So they were handling a lot of blueprints, getting a lot done in this little bit of time. So I don't know, I'll explain some of these numbers, and for those of you in the back who might not be able to read it, we'll just kind of talk about this generally. So one of my favorite examples of kind of the uniqueness of this project, how they were able to build the reactors simultaneously. And we talk a lot about the reactors. In just a minute, we'll talk more about the other sides of the operation because there's so much more than just the 5 reactors on site. But the reactors here, so along the bottom, I'll try to use my laser. All right, so R&P reactor right here. So these are those letter names that I said with the areas on site. So R, P, K, L, and C are all areas on site that have reactor buildings within them. So R and P reactor are the first to be built. The floor plan, this is kind of the layout of the reactor building. The layout is very different for K, L, and C. If you look at the start dates, these are all starting. The first one starts in June 1951. The last one starts in November 1951. So you're only looking at a 5 to 6 month difference on those. But the floor plans end up being very different. Because they were using flexible design, they were able to look at our reactor and P reactor in a way they were kind of over-designed. DuPont was able to use that previous experience with the nuclear facilities they had built before, use that as an example. They were able to learn how Savannah River was a little bit different. So for example, our reactor, that facility has what was known as a clarification plant that because of the river quality of the Savannah River, they didn't end up needing that clarification plant. So looking at only the 5 to 6 month difference of the start date, the floor plan is very different on those reactors. So that C reactor actually ends up being less concrete, so they were able to save on materials and save on time and labor and all of that. All of this, the driving force of the building and how quickly all this happened was the National Defense Mission of trying to get weapons material out the door as quickly as possible. So they were building very quickly, very efficiently, looking at cost. The buildings weren't pretty, but they still are standing today, and we're still reusing a lot of them because of the quality of the work that was being done and those unique missions that the site was built for. And so then you can also look here at when they went critical is when they were kind of working efficiently. So between June 1951, December 1953, that's how quickly they got our reactor up and running. And then C reactor was the last to go critical, and that was March 1955. So I don't know if y'all can tell, this is a picture of construction workers all sitting at one of their safety meetings. So the construction workforce is kind of interesting. So we'll talk a little bit. I have a picture towards the end of one of the towns that was displaced with the building of the site. So the site is about 310 square miles. And so when they were looking for a location, they were looking for a site area that would displace as few people as possible but it did end up displacing about 6,000 people. So you have some of those people who ended up working on site, whether it was construction or later on in operations as well. And then you have a lot of construction workers who actually moved into the area for a temporary job of working at Savannah River. So this was one of the first times that trailer homes were really used during this time so that the construction workers were able to bring their families with them. So the peak, I'll go ahead and just let you know, peak of the site, I believe was 1957. It was about 38,000 workers. So you have some overlap there of construction workers and operations as well. Today, I think there's about 12,000 and growing.
13 plus.
13 now, continuing to grow. So we're going kind of through that rehiring as well. But so you have a lot of construction workers, like I said, who move into the area or locally are able to stay on and find a job in order to get the site built as quickly as possible. Does anyone have any questions about the construction period, 1951 and 1955? All right, then we'll jump into operations. All right, so we're going to be looking just kind of at the Cold War operations. And we, like I said, this is not a technical talk, so we're going to just kind of talk about the different, we talked a bit about reactors. We're going to talk about what kind of helps the reactor to run with the plant processes. And then we'll look at the workforce with the Cold War operations, how that's a little bit different than the construction workers. And then even though the goal of this site was to produce weapons material, plutonium and tritium, there were opportunities for research components as well that come in. So we'll talk just a little bit about some of those examples. So I know this is probably a little bit small to kind of see, so I'll just kind of talk you through it. So we talked about the reactor. The reactor normally gets all the glory. When you think about nuclear, you can't help but think about the nuclear reactor. But you have to have reactor rods to go into a reactor. And so on site, they actually were able to, they would purchase the uranium, but then they would make their own reactor rods on site. And so this allowed for flexibility of design. The lab was able to help kind of design some different reactor rods over the years. It was around 80 or so ended up being made. And that was, sometimes it would make different products. Sometimes that was a research goal, those different reactor rods. But sometimes it was looking at kind of saving money and it runs a little bit longer or it runs really quickly so that they can produce very, very quickly. So allowing the reactor rod design and manufacturing to happen on site allowed for things to be able to improve over the years. So this is kind of the, I know this picture is very small. There's equipment here for the fuel and target fabrication. The other thing that I mentioned that they needed for the reactors to run at Savannah River was the heavy water. So this is the heavy water extraction facility. So heavy water was used as the moderator in the reactor. Like I said, Manhattan Project, they used graphite and the graphite pile. So there were a couple of changes with the reactor. This is the tank top here. The graphite pile, the rods would actually go horizontal into it at Savannah River because they used heavy water. The rods would actually go down vertical instead. So with the heavy water moderator, basically the moderator just slows down the reactor reaction so that it can work very efficiently and the neutrons can be absorbed the way that they need to. So they knew that heavy water would work well. It just was expensive to produce and it had to go through the process of the extraction. So they were actually, and over here, this is listing of the products. Heavy water, because it's so expensive to produce, they were actually able to sell it as a product to labs and that kind of thing later on as well. So then, of course, we talked about the reactor. So there's a reactor tank down there. So once you have the rods in the reactor and they're irradiated, then they have to go and be separated out. So when they have the reactor rod, it's usually like an aluminum casing, and the material gets put within that aluminum casing. So it goes over to the separations facility. This is kind of like a long canal. It has different equipment pieces along it that just kind of go through the different processes of kind of, it boils things down, for lack of a better word. That's not really how it works. It gets it where it's basically all a liquid form, and then they can shake it out to where it separates out the product from the planned radioactive waste. And so they know that they're going to have that radioactive waste because think about that aluminum casing. That's not part of the product, but it's now radioactive. So that is planned radioactive waste that goes over to the waste tank farm. So this is kind of this big tank that was built for long-term storage. And then they also, like I said, separate out the waste from the product. So most of the time, it was going to be plutonium, which kind of takes the form of like a hockey puck at Savannah River. That was generally how it was produced. And then tritium is a gas. And so there were other products that were made as well. So over here on this list here, so plutonium-239 is the weapons grade plutonium. Tritium is the gas. We just talked about heavy water. Californium is one of the research projects that they were able to do. It could be used as a medical source, but it's very expensive to produce because of how many rounds it has to go through in order to be irradiated the correct way. Plutonium-238 was a space fuel that was produced, and then the curium, cobalt, those were also some research aspects that they looked at as well. So generally plutonium, like I said, hockey puck, and tritium, that was a gas. And tritium is still extracted on site. That's one of the continuing missions on site, but there are no reactors running. All 5 reactors were closed down by 1989 to produce product. So they didn't run to produce product after 1989. Any questions about the operations of things? I think that's as technical as we get, so.
How did they get rid of the heavy water?
So the heavy water was very, within the reactor, they were able to purify it, and they did as much as they could to protect it so they could reuse it over and over because it was expensive to produce. So they took a lot of care with it. However, there are still drums of tritiated heavy water on site. Tritium has a very short half-life, and so Bob, anytime you want to jump in. Bob knows more about the current missions. I know that there are drums, but I don't know what the plan is other than just wait it out.
So we have thousands of drums of heavy water stored in one of our old reactors and one of our other current reactors that we've repurposed. They do have been tritiated, have tritiated particles in them. Tritium has a very short half-life compared to plutonium. Plutonium has about a 2,000-year half-life, and it has to go through many thousands of years before it becomes non-radioactive. Tritium has a 12.5-year half-life, so just a few half-lives, and it's a very low source. So we are waiting it out, so to speak. Also, the country of Canada is interested in purchasing some of our heavy water. They actually have reactors in Canada that use that use water, heavy water, for their production. So it's kind of a thing between the U.S. and Canada right now, and we're not just going to dump it back into the river. We will remediate as we can, take care of that water, and then dispose of it properly.
So once heavy water is produced, it stays stable then?
Yes. So again, it's extracted from regular water. Okay, regular water has the D2O heavy water element in it. It's not radioactive. It only gets irradiated when it goes through the reactor process. So yeah, so if it didn't have the tritium in it, we could dump it right back into the Savannah River with no harm. But it does, and we're not. All right. Does that help?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions about operations? All right. So the workforce, so we talked a little bit about the construction workers, and I do still have a picture here in the center of construction workers because there was always ongoing construction. There's construction happening on site today. So construction was always happening and improving and building new facilities and that kind of thing, even after that 1955 date that we kind of use as the construction date. And then we talked about the lab already. So today is the Savannah River National Lab. That they received their national distinction in 2004, but they were built into that original design that DuPont had. They knew that they needed to be able to have that research component, so the lab has always been there. So when you're thinking about this area, prior to the site being built, it's a very agricultural area. Textiles is really the main industry. You don't have a lot of scientists in this area. You don't have a lot of engineers. So the site being built really changed the demographic to bring in some of this workforce. I just like this picture. So this is actually, she has her name is in here. This is, they're making her badge. The badge is still made today. We don't make it like this. They can make it much quicker. I think there was actually a newspaper article in the 1950s newspapers where they talk about how long it would take to make the badge because they had to wait for the glue to set and before it could go to the next process. So, but I just like this picture, how he's taking her photo to get her ready for her badge. And then another component, so obviously a nuclear facility. Early on, DuPont knew from construction, they had the standard of radiation dose. So this picture here, she is part of what is known as health physics, or the radiation control group. And so basically, if there were going to be workers that were going into a contaminated area or where there was going to be radiation or potential radiation, they would wear either a film badge back in the day, a dosimeter, kind of looks like a pencil, and I think that's what she's actually reading here, or what's known today as a TLD. But you would wear this for a certain amount of time, and then you would turn it into health physics. They would put it in their little machine to read what your dose was so that they could keep track of what the employee's dose was, so that if you were starting to get to a limit that they weren't happy with, they could take you off or switch you to a different position until just to keep that dose as low as possible. We have patrol. So patrol is still, not DuPont patrol is not still on site today, but there is what's known as, it's a paramilitary group known as Centera. It was Wackenhut before that. But early on in the 1950s, all the way up until 1984, DuPont had its own patrol on site that provided everything from kind of just, they could pull you over for speeding, all the way through checking for contraband and that kind of thing as you were coming on site. And then I mentioned a little bit about the utilities, the infrastructure. So not to go back into the construction of things, but like I said, you think about these 5 reactors being built, 2 of those separations areas. All of this, there were some roads from those displaced towns that they were able to reuse, but there's a lot of infrastructure that ends up needing to be built and kept up and maintained. When you have 38,000 workers on site, you need a place for them to go to the bathroom. You need water sanitation, that kind of thing. So along with trying to build these reactors and get them up and running as quickly as possible, they're also having to have all that infrastructure as well. My program did a oral history with one of the traffic and transportation managers years ago, and he said, you can't get to the reactor, you can't run a reactor if you can't get to it. And so it's true, if the roads are poorly maintained, if there's not a road to get to the reactor, no one's going to work there. So we think about kind of the reactor control room operator when we think about a nuclear facility, but there's so much more for the workforce than that. Within the control room, it's usually about 10 people or so on a shift. So you have 5 reactors, so that's 50 control room operators, and then I don't know how many shifts they would do. So it's a very small percentage of people on site that work in the control room, right? So you have all of this support staff that kind of helps to make sure everything is running. Like I said, it's so much more than just the reactors. And this also created a lot of job opportunity for the community. So like I said, in most cases, we didn't have the scientists. So we did have some scientists that moved down into this area, some engineers. But then you also had people, in the 1950s, there weren't a lot of people who were just knew how to run a control room and run a reactor. So the procedures really allowed for a lot of on-the-job training. So you had people that were hired in and could learn how to work the facilities and that kind of thing. So a lot of job opportunity came with the building of the site. And then, like I said, there were a lot of research opportunities as well. So around the 1960s, the site started reaching the main quotas that they needed for the weapons production. And I should mention, I don't remember if there's another time that I talk about it, Savannah River never built any bombs. They only produced the material. So the plutonium and tritium, once it was produced, it would go to another facility within the Atomic Energy Commission complex. And that was on purpose to they compartmentalized throughout the country who was going to do which piece of it. So the Savannah River, like I said, they didn't produce and dig out the uranium. They would purchase the uranium. Savannah River's piece of the puzzle across the country and making that weapons stockpile was just to produce plutonium and tritium, and then that material would go to be put into the bomb. But that did not happen at Savannah River. So once the stockpile that the Atomic Energy Commission thought was needed for the nuclear stockpile, once the plutonium and tritium, they were kind of starting to get to the numbers for that immediate need. Then the Atomic Energy Commission also was interested in peaceful uses for atomic energy as well. And so because of some of the facilities that were at Savannah River, they kind of turned to them and would give them certain things. So heavy water, for example, because there was that extraction plant on site, they were curious if heavy water would work in a civilian power reactor. So that was one of the facilities that Savannah River ran in the 60s just to kind of as a research project for the Atomic Energy Commission. I mentioned the plutonium-238 that was used as a space fuel. So this actually, the space fuel, because it's very small, it has a high heat source, it's great kind of like as the fuel, the battery, for some deep space missions that NASA did. So all of the deep space missions used plutonium-238 that was produced at Savannah River plant. And then the neutrino. So the neutrino was actually the University of California brought in some of their researchers because the reactor made such a unique kind of environment. They were able to prove that the neutrino existed. So the neutrino was a subatomic particle, and they knew it existed, but they hadn't been able to prove it. And so the reactor kind of created an environment where they were able to tell the weight difference and prove that the neutrino did exist. So P reactor, kind of its claim to fame is that it's where the neutrino was proven. And there were many other research opportunities as well. And I say the 1960s, they were reaching their quotas. The Savannah River was always still producing plutonium and tritium over the years, along with these research missions as well. So it was just kind of as they reached those immediate needs for the weapons stockpile. And then just a couple of the community changes. Like I said, the site being built, it's an amazing kind of engineering feat and all of that, but I just find it so interesting, the local impact that came from this national kind of defense mission. It has its own national story, but it has changed so much of the local community as well. So we'll just jump in. So the infrastructure, with the people moving in, the influx of people moving into this area, they needed a place to live. So there are a lot of neighborhoods that were built in the 1950s and 60s that are still homes today. And this was within Augusta and Aiken. Barnwell, I think Kathy mentioned at the beginning, so the site does cover Aiken County, Allendale County, and Barnwell County. So in our collection on site, we actually have some of the plat maps of the neighborhoods that were built during this time, and like I said, are still standing in homes today, but the population really changed with the infrastructure needs, because once you start building houses, then you have to look at again, water sanitation needs, looking at if the hospitals can withstand the population. So there were hospital improvements that kind of came, all of it kind of trickled down in that way. The industry, I touched on this earlier, this is one of the displaced towns. This was Myers Mill, and it was a railroad depot town. You can see the railroad depot over here. So this is Myers Mill. It had a cotton gin, the post office is here. And the displaced communities, I mean, this, you're not getting to see where the people lived. This was kind of their, like, downtown, I would guess, where their post office is and all of that. They looked like normal small town communities with houses and churches, and very much the people were ingrained into the community. So I don't want to downplay that by any means. But the industry, just in this general area, like I said, was textiles, agriculture. And so bringing a nuclear facility into this area really kind of changed and shaped that outlook for the people who worked on site. They had a positive experience. It was safe, it felt secure, they had job opportunities. And so then later on, when they wanted to start to put nuclear power plants in this area, it was much less scary than if you're going from this to a nuclear power plant being built in the area. So it really just kind of allowed for a mind shift. It also shifted how the country looked at the South in industry. And so again, just brought some different opportunities that otherwise it wouldn't have happened that way. And then also the education. So I've already mentioned a few times about just the changing demographic that came to this area, having scientists, engineers, those families coming along with them. And so this is actually, I think, a site tour where they have the students coming to kind of just check out what's happening on site. The site also had employees that would help to judge in science fairs and that kind of thing. So there's definitely been this outreach component over the years of the employees within the community as well helping out. The University of South Carolina, Aiken, actually kind of got started as a grassroots effort because of the engineers and this changing demographic and the need for having that continuing education. So I talked a little bit about my facility, the curation facility located on site, and I think I was going to say, there are bus tours that every so often throughout the year, but Bob's going to talk about bus tours in just a minute, in order to see our facility. But generally, the facility I'm at is closed to the public. We're not set up like a museum. But over the years, we've been able to develop a partnership with the SRS Museum. And so I think Linda's going to do a quick little, just an invitation to the museum.
A surprise to me, but my name's Linda Lindler and I'm the director of the SRS Museum. If you haven't been to see us, please do come by. We're located at 224 Lawrence Street Southwest. We're open 10 to 4, Wednesday through Saturday. We'd love to take you through our exhibits, and we do about an hour is it for a tour. You are more than welcome to come through at your own pace and read the panels, but we do talk about the displaced. We have an exhibit that is entitled 6,000 Stories. It talks about the 6,000 people who were displaced in the hometowns of Ellington and Myers Mill that Melissa touched on. But we've got quite the story to tell. And so we are a small but mighty museum, and we like to tell everybody that we're the place where history and science collide. It's a pun. Sorry. Feel free to laugh. We appreciate that. But we would like to have you come by anytime. You don't have to have an appointment for a tour unless you're a group of about 9 or 10, and then we just want to make sure we have a volunteer or a staff member available.
And then I'm going to call Bob up in just a minute, but like I said, the kind of idea of this presentation was that the site was uniquely designed to be able to continue the missions that they're doing today on site. So there are some cleanup missions that continue to happen. So those waste tanks that we talked about in the 1970s, they started looking at kind of how they were going to deal with the waste because it was built as long-term storage but never permanent storage. So the Defense Waste Processing Facility, if you've ever heard of that, that is one of the continuing missions on site today where they take the radioactive waste that's in those tanks and they process it into a stable format that is forever storage. So that's one of the continuing missions that kind of has come with the legacy of the Cold War. But then there's also the current missions and the new missions that are happening that have really come from having that background of the site being safe, secure, able to deal and handle the nuclear defense missions since the 1950s. So I think Bob is going to give you a little snippet of that and then talk a little bit about our bus tours. When we do the historic bus tours, I'm usually on the bus and with the archaeology group, George Wingard has representation there too. But Bob is always there to answer our new mission questions. So I know he can talk much easier about that.
I don't need
that.
mic.
You don't. I need the microphone.
I don't need the mic. My name is Bob Bonnett, and I am the tour coordinator of Savannah River Site. I love what I do because I do take you through the history and what it meant for these 6,000 people to give up their lives for this project to come here and help save us from the Russians. Again, we talk about the history. We talk about our missions that we had for so many years, 45 plus years when our reactors ran. We ride by an old reactor, let you see the scope of it. You know, Melissa said we're 310 square miles, and it's hard for me to put that into perspective, but if you think of it this way, the city of Atlanta would fit inside of Savannah River Site. That's how large an area it is, almost 200,000 acres, but 70% of it are woodland. So mostly when we ride around, we see a lot of pine trees. But there's a history behind the pine trees as well. I could talk the rest of the day about it, but this is Melissa's presentation. We do offer bus tours. I have some brochures that tell you how to sign up for them. We have two types of tours. We have the mission-related tours. We do 2 of those every month. That rides around. We show you our current facilities, our old facilities. We talk about our new missions, which are coming our way. Okay? You've heard a lot about the Savannah River Site Plutonium Processing Facility, a very vital mission to the United States and even possibly the world that we have to get going by 2032. I can explain a lot more about that on the tour. Again, I won't take too much of Melissa's time. We are still manufacturing tritium. We're the only place in the United States that's ever manufactured tritium for the warfighter from the beginning. Okay, we're still doing that. We'll do that at least the next 50 years, according to the National Nuclear Security Administration, who is actually going to become the operator. They're going to become the landlord of the site on October 1, our fiscal year begins 2025. Very big things are coming to Savannah River Site. Jobs are not going away, jobs are coming away. Up to 6,000 people will be hired to finish that mission and another 2,000 permanent employees to continue that mission, which we're told right now should last at least 70 years. Okay? We are doing the environmental cleanup. We talk about the processes that go on with our one of our sister companies. I work for Savannah River Nuclear Solutions. We manage and operate the site itself. Savannah River Mission Completion deals with all of the liquid waste product, our legacy waste, as we call it, from the years that we did run our nuclear program or our nuclear reactors out there. All right, so again, there's brochures out on the front table, and I have some more here. We'd love to have you come on a tour. Our next tours coming up are in March. We take 4 tours, and we go out to one of our old town sites. If you're going to talk about those a little more, you're going to talk about Dunbarton at all? Yeah. Then I will. All right. So you've heard of New Ellington? Well, there was an original town site called Ellington. Okay, now everybody thinks that Ellington picked up and moved to New Ellington. That's not quite the story. But we'll tell you that story. I won't give too much away today. But in the spring, we go out to the old town site of Dunbarton. There's a historic sign out there. You see the old curbs and gutters from the 1950s that are still there. No buildings are standing. But George and Melissa talk about the history of that town, and that's really what we call our historic tour. So we have 4 of those coming up in March. You can go to our website. The dates are listed there. We still have some availability for those tours in March. We'd love to have you come along. Okay? And then in the fall, we go out to Ellington, the old town. And at the end of March this year and the end of October, we have a new tour that we're doing this year where we go strictly to Ellington and we walk through the old streets. We said where the old steps of the old school used to be there. We see where one of the old churches used to be there. We have some historic signs that tell you that Uncle Jet's house was over here, Mr. Frank's barn was over here, and things like that. It's really neat to go step back in time and talk about these people that gave up everything they do for this project to come to this area. They felt it was their patriotic duty to give up everything. So anyway, would love to have you on a tour. If you have questions afterwards, I'll be standing around. So Melissa, thank you.
That's why I wanted Bob to talk about that. And if you're at all curious about the site, going on those bus tours is really, if you get nothing else, it's such a different world to see. I don't think unless you see it, you can really understand the size. And where Bob was talking about driving around and seeing all the pine trees and the facilities, it's really interesting. And so I would highly encourage you to take either the general tour or the historic bus tour. I think that's about all that I have, or I could also talk a lot more, but I'm going to cut it off there. But if anybody has any questions, I think we're...
How far is the facility from here?
About a 45-minute drive?
It depends on where you're driving to, I guess.
Yeah.
So I work on site, and luckily my commute's about 20 minutes from my house, but for my husband it's about 35. So we don't ever get to eat lunch together on site because he works too far away. But so depending on the Aiken side, about 30 minutes or so to the badge office first barricade that you would get to on the Aiken side. 30 minutes, about 30 minutes. I don't know what.
Depends on how heavy the traffic is on Whiskey Road.
That is also true.
I don't know about that,
23 miles.
I saw a hand back there first, yes.
So you commented about the 38,000 workers on the site. You must have had 25,000 workers building houses, schools, and things outside of the site, and all their families. What happens after 1955 when most of those people go? I mean, was there an economic downturn in this area because of that?
No, because at that time, at least not that I have seen any real reference to, because at that time, for one, you're seeing a lot of improvements happening within the community. There's some funding that comes from the government because of this being a national mission. And so you have the construction workers, they were mostly living in trailer parks. So as far as their housing and all of that, I understand what you're saying. They were building, but they were building for kind of that next influx of engineers and scientists that were being hired on. So no, I haven't really seen reference to any kind of shift in the 1950s just because there continued to be so much growth that came after the construction workers. Good question.
What about, is there a push to move into Aiken, the city? Like I keep seeing in the paper and stuff about Savannah River Site taking over certain areas, like the old hotel behind that recently, you know.
For office space kind of thing? There are leased offices, like the post office is not owned, but is it owned?
It's leased.
It's
Right.
leased.
You mind
Yeah.
if I speak now real quick?
Absolutely.
So the company that I work for, the managing operating contractor, that is our downtown office, as we call it, Savannah River Nuclear Solutions, okay? That's just our downtown office. When we have interviews and somebody doesn't need to or want to go out to the site, we'll do the interviews here in town. Now, we are leasing some space right now because we are hiring people for this new mission. We don't have anywhere to put. We have a housing shortage out there. So the Centennial Commercial over behind, across the street from Walmart, back in that area. Yeah, South Aiken High School back in there. We're starting to lease space there. Now, we did that back in the 1970s and 80s when we had 25,000 people still working. A lot of our facilities are not able to support the personnel that we need to help with these new missions. So yes, we are moving some office type personnel into the areas, but missions wise, no, everything's going to stay out there inside the barricades. Okay, hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Where do you look, is there plans for providing housing for all of these new people coming in?
Not by the government. Not by the government. As you've seen, there's, if you ride along Highway 1, you see where they just knock down a whole bunch of trees, and next thing you know, there's going to be apartments and houses and things like that. There's a lot of growth coming our way. That's one reason all of our houses have gone up in value so much lately, because this is very coveted area. Not just here, but in Augusta as well, the surrounding communities. So yes, there's building going on, as you can see, all across the town and the county to help support these new folks coming in. Now, in the meantime, we've got people retiring. So, we have turnover of retirees and new people coming in to backfill those positions, and the new positions are coming. So, but yes, no, the government's not going to fund any housing.
Yes.
Good question.
This is all a very positive presentation. I just am curious, have there ever been protests against this, or health issues with early workers or any of that kind of thing?
So there have been anti-nuclear protests. They're actually, just from a historical standpoint, I know that there is a sign. I don't know if you've ever seen the sign that has like the line of where they can stand, and we need to collect it into our facility because it is part of the history. And I know that we have some anti-nuclear t-shirts in our collection. So it is very much part of it. So yes, while I say that this was a great opportunity, I do think that has been the overwhelming kind of idea in this area in particular, because it did provide so much opportunity, and it has been done safely over the years. So there are not a lot of. Do you want to help me out on the?
I'll speak to it if you'd like.
Because you probably know more on the.
Well, the very first tour that we had this year, public tour, I had a lot of what we call anti-news on our tour. And there were a lot of questions about what we do, how we do it, and we wanted to show, in all honesty, and how safely we do it. We've done it for over 70 years. We've never had a major incident at Savannah River Site because of our safety culture. That's our number one job, is safety at Savannah River Site. Number two is what we do for our occupation. Okay. But yes, even when we were talking about repurposing the old box facility into the plutonium processing facility now, the antis were at the public meetings where, we announced to the public, this is what's coming our way. We let the public come and speak on it or against it. Very few people spoke against it, but the people that spoke against it said, well, if you're going to put it anywhere, Savannah River Site is the safest place to do it. So we don't get very much backlash. Yes, there's a there's a gentleman that runs something called the Savannah River, what is it called? SRS Watch, okay? He's very anti about a lot of things. I don't want to say that we do, but a lot of things nuclear. He doesn't speak all the time about Savannah River Site, but the nuclear complex across the United States as it is. He talks about how we don't need as many nuclear weapons. Well, if you're reading the news these days, this is a pretty critical mission, okay? Because for the first time since the atomic era began, we're not number one in the world. You've got Russia and you've got China, okay? And they're getting off the chain, all right? So this is nuclear posture that, it's like you can't put toothpaste back in the tube, okay? We've got nuclear weapons, now we have to maintain those stockpiles. Maintaining the stockpiles helps to give us deterrence, okay? Because if somebody bad out there in the world wants to do something bad, we're going to respond likewise, okay? I know, I don't want to get political, but I don't want to be the world's police officers, but, we have to try to keep peace the best we can. Having a deterrent is the best way to keep peace right now until something else comes along there, okay? That's what we strive for. I hope we never, ever have to deploy another nuclear weapon ever across this world, ever. 2 has been plenty, more than enough. I hope it never happens again, but we have that stockpile to help ensure that. I'm sorry, I can't go. Yes,
yes, you're talking about safety. So once the products have been developed, how are they shipped out? How are they transported to the other parts of it?
all of that is, I don't want to say it's top secret, but you have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, you have the Department of Transportation. A lot of it is shipped by truck across roads, but it's a convoy. I mean, and it's a convoy of safety vehicles. It's a convoy of different types of vehicles that lead the pack, that follow the pack. The packaging that this material goes in is very safe. You can walk right up to it and touch it. It looks like a 55-gallon drum, but it's got 7 layers of 2 layers of lead inside. It's packaging like foam core, things like that. It's just, it would take me the rest of the day to explain the safety of this material coming to and leaving Savannah River Site. But trust me, there's a lot of research that goes into it. And Savannah River National Lab is actually an authority on the shipping container. I've seen some of the testing that they do, and it's amazing. They'll drop this canister 100 feet, and it won't be dented. They have put it through fires that are up to 1,500 degrees for 2 hours, and it's not been penetrated. So there's a lot that goes into, a lot of science that goes into a lot of things we do. I don't know if that eases your mind or makes you feel worse, but come on a tour with us. We can talk more in depth on the tour about a lot of these things if folks have questions. Okay? Thank you.
Yeah.